The year 274 since the Nativity of Christ, Rome. The eternal city, heart of the world, was frozen in jubilant ecstasy. The air trembled with the roar of the crowd, with the deafening thunder of trumpets and drums. Today, Rome celebrates a triumph, not just a triumph over another barbarian tribe on the frontiers. Today, Rome honors its savior, Emperor Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, the man who received from the Senate the title *Restitutor Orbis*, which means restorer of the world. He, the son of a simple peasant from Illyria, had with an iron hand pulled the empire from the abyss of chaos, stitching its torn parts back together again. The triumphal procession, that apotheosis of Roman might, was a grand spectacle designed to demonstrate to the citizens and the gods the greatness of their state. At the front were carried captured standards, images of conquered cities and rivers. Wagons bore heaps of treasures, gold, silver, precious stones, exotic utensils capable of dazzling with their brilliance. Lines of captives were led, Gothic chieftains with wild beards, Germanic warriors bound in coarse chains. But then the crowd erupted in a new, particularly ferocious roar. All eyes were fixed on the central part of the procession. There, ahead of the emperor's triumphal chariot, drawn by a quadriga of white horses, she walked, a woman. Her beauty, even in this humiliating position, was striking, silencing even the most boisterous onlookers. She was tall and slender. Her skin had the swarthy hue of the desert sun, and her eyes, black as obsidian, burned with a fire in which indomitable pride and bottomless sorrow were mixed. Her dress of purple silk was embroidered with precious stones that flashed under the Italian sun, but her hands and feet were bound in chains. Not of common iron, no, of pure gold. These golden chains were so heavy that a special slave had to support them so she could walk. This was Septimia Zenobia. Just a few years ago, her name alone made the entire East tremble. Queen of Palmyra, Augusta, ruler of an empire that stretched from the banks of the Nile to the Taurus Mountains, a woman who had challenged Rome itself, who had dared to tear away its richest provinces. She called herself a descendant of Cleopatra, and like her great predecessor, she dreamed of her own Eastern empire capable of speaking with Rome on equal terms. Today her dream lay in the dust of the Appian Way, and her empire, no more than a ghost, was scattered by the wind. Who was she, this woman in golden chains? How did she, the ruler of an oasis city lost in the Syrian desert, manage to create an empire and challenge the most powerful state in human history? What force drove her? Excessive ambition, love for her homeland, or cold political calculation? To find the answers to these questions, we must journey into the past, into one of the most turbulent and bloody periods of Roman history. We will travel to the very heart of the desert, to a city of columns and caravans, to witness the birth and fall of one of the brightest and most tragic stars in the firmament of the ancient world. This is the story of Zenobia, Queen of the East. Before our heroine takes the stage, we must understand the world that produced her. For Zenobia is unthinkable without Palmyra, just as Palmyra is unthinkable without the desert that surrounded it. The city that the Romans called Palmyra and the locals called Tadmor was a miracle, an oasis in the midst of a boundless sea of sand. A point on the map where not just roads but entire civilizations intersected. Imagine the endless Syrian desert. By day it is a scorching pan where the air shimmers with heat and the horizon is lost in a sandy haze. By night it is a bottomless black dome, studded with diamond stars. There is nothing here but sand, stone, and wind. And suddenly in the midst of this ocean of nothingness, like a mirage, it appears. A city, a forest of elegant Corinthian columns of pinkish limestone that seems cast from pure gold at sunset. Majestic temples dedicated to strange gods, triumphal arches, theaters, markets, luxurious villas, and, stretching to the horizon, a great colonnade straight as an arrow. This was Palmyra, the city of palms, the bride of the desert. Its birth and prosperity were due to a single factor: geography. Palmyra was located exactly halfway between two worlds, two rival civilizations, the Roman Empire to the west and the Parthian, and later Persian, Empire to the east. It was a natural staging post on the great trade route that connected the Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and even distant China. All the most expensive and desirable goods of antiquity flowed through Palmyra. Caravans, sometimes consisting of thousands of camels, brought silk, spices, precious stones, incense, and ivory from east to west. And from west to east, Roman glass, purple fabrics, wine, and olive oil. The Palmyrens were geniuses of logistics and commerce. They did not just let caravans pass through their territory. They ensured their safety, provided guides, water, and fodder. They built caravanserais and wells all along the route. For this, they charged duties. The Palmyrene tariff, discovered by archaeologists and dated to the year 137 of our era, is a most detailed tax code, listing duties on everything, on every camel, on every bale of silk, on every slave, on every wineskin. It was on this transit, on this role as an intermediary between worlds, that Palmyra's fabulous wealth grew. Power in the city belonged to a few oligarchic families whose names we know from inscriptions. The Septimii, the Julii Aurelii, the Malchos. They were not just merchants, they were princes of the desert, heads of powerful clans who controlled sections of the trade route. Their wealth was unimaginable, and they did not hesitate to display it. Their tower tombs in the famous Valley of the Tombs served not only as sepulchres but also as declarations of status, visible for many kilometers. Inside, they were adorned with frescoes and the famous sculpted portraits of the deceased, whose melancholic eyes with widely opened pupils still gaze at us through the centuries. But behind the glitter of this elite lay a complex social structure. Free craftsmen, camel drivers, slaves, mercenary soldiers, Bedouin nomads living in tents by the city walls. It was a seething cauldron of peoples and cultures, cemented by common benefit and governed by the iron hand of the aristocracy. This duality, this borderline position, was reflected in everything. Palmyrene culture was a unique fusion, a syncretic crucible in which the most diverse influences were smelted. The aristocracy spoke Aramaic but was also fluent in Greek, the language of culture and trade throughout the Hellenistic East. They wore Parthian trousers and Roman togas. Their art combined Greco-Roman form with Eastern content. The statues of wealthy citizens were made in the Roman style but with a frontal, static posture characteristic of Eastern art. The religion of the Palmyrenes was an equally complex pantheon. At its head stood a triad of gods. The supreme god Bel, the local equivalent of the Babylonian Marduk or the Greek Zeus, the moon god Aglibol, and the sun god Yarhibol. Their huge, majestic temple, the Temple of Bel, was the religious center of the city, occupying a gigantic area. But alongside them, dozens of other deities were worshipped. Arab desert gods, Phoenician gods of trade, Greek and Roman gods. It was a religion of merchants, flexible and tolerant, ready to accept any god who could bring luck and protection. Politically, Palmyra also occupied a unique position. Formerly, it was part of the Roman Empire in the province of Syria. It paid taxes to Rome and its citizens had Roman citizenship. But due to its remoteness and strategic importance, it enjoyed enormous autonomy. Rome was governed by a city council, consisting of representatives of the richest aristocratic families. At the head of these families were chieftains or sheikhs, who possessed almost royal power. They commanded their own armed detachments consisting of mounted archers, who protected the caravan routes from raids by Bedouin nomads. The Palmyrene army was a force to be reckoned with. Its core was heavy cavalry or cataphracts, where both rider and horse were covered from head to toe in scale or lamellar armor. Armed with long lances or ***, They were capable of breaking through an enemy infantry line with a single charge. They were supported by detachments of light-mounted archers capable of showering the enemy with a cloud of arrows and instantly disappearing into the desert. This army was perfectly adapted for warfare in local conditions. Such was the world into which, around the year 240, a girl was born who was given the name Bat-Zabai, which in Aramaic means daughter of Zabai. The Greeks and Romans would call her Zenobia. She was born at the pinnacle of this world, into one of the noblest and most influential aristocratic families of Palmyra. She was a daughter of her city, proud, educated, speaking several languages, having absorbed the cultures of both West and East. But she did not yet know that it was she who was destined to raise this oasis city to an unprecedented height, and to lead it to a terrible demise. For the era in which she was to live forgave neither weakness nor excessive ambition. A crisis was approaching that threatened to engulf not only Palmyra, but the eternal city itself. To understand the scale and audacity of Zenobia's actions, it is not enough to admire the colonnades of Palmyra. We must for a moment avert our gaze from the shining oasis and look at the darkness that was gathering over the world in the mid-3rd century of our era. For the history of the Palmyrene Empire is not a story of creation in peacetime. It is a story of a rapid rise on the ruins of a crumbling world order. The period that historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century was, without exaggeration, the most terrible time in the history of the Roman Empire. Imagine a giant organism that for centuries had seemed eternal and indestructible, and suddenly it begins to decompose from within. The empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates began to crack at the seams. The problem was systemic and multi-layered. Firstly, there was a political collapse. The era of the 5 good emperors was long past. Now, rulers were appointed not by the Senate or the people, but by the legions. The army had become the main and only maker of policy. Any popular general who won a victory on the frontier could be proclaimed emperor by his soldiers. A monstrous succession of so-called barracks emperors began. In 50 years, from 235 to 284, more than 20 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers succeeded to the throne. Almost all of them died violent deaths, were killed in battle with a rival, fell at the hands of their own soldiers, or became victims of a palace conspiracy. The empire was engulfed in permanent civil war. The legions which were supposed to defend the borders were slaughtering each other deep within the country, fighting for the next claimant to the throne. Secondly, it was an economic catastrophe. Constant wars required huge sums of money. Emperors, to pay the legions which were their only support, resorted to the simplest method: debasing the coinage. The silver denarius, once the foundation of the financial system, turned into a copper coin merely coated with silver. The precious metal content in it dropped to almost zero. This caused hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed. Trade came to a standstill as money became worthless. The state switched to barter and requisitions. Everything necessary for the army's needs was simply taken from peasants and townspeople. Cities became deserted, roads became dangerous due to robbers, and once prosperous provinces fell into decline. This was not just a crisis of governance, it was a crisis of faith in the very idea of Rome. For centuries, to be Roman had meant to belong to a stable, orderly world, protected by invincible legions and eternal gods. Now the gods seemed silent. The legions fought each other, and the world was disintegrating into patches of fear and local interests. People stopped thinking of themselves as citizens of a great empire and began to think of themselves simply as Gauls, Syrians, or Egyptians. This centrifugal force of separatism was the true disease, and figures like Posthumus in Gaul and Zenobia in the East were not just its causes but its most striking symptoms. Thirdly, it was a demographic and social crisis. Around the year 249, a terrible epidemic swept through the empire known in history as the Plague of Cyprian, which was probably smallpox or measles. It raged for almost 20 years, claiming, according to some estimates, up to a third of the population. In Rome alone, at the height of the epidemic, up to 5,000 people died per day. Huge territories were depopulated. This led to a shortage of labor in agriculture and recruits for the army. And against the backdrop of this internal collapse, external enemies, sensing the giant's weakness, went on the offensive. From the north, across the Rhine and Danube, hordes of barbarian tribes, Goths, Franks, Alemanni, poured into the empire. They broke through the weakened borders, plundered cities, and took thousands of captives. Their raids reached Greece, Asia Minor, and even Italy. But the most terrible threat arose in the east on the borders of Zenobia's native Syria. The old, weakened Parthian Empire with which Rome had fought for centuries fell. In 224, a new, aggressive, and energetic dynasty came to power in Iran. The Sassanians. This was not just a change of rulers, it was an ideological and religious revolution. The Sassanians considered themselves the heirs of the ancient Persian kings, the Achaemenids, and laid claim to all the Asian possessions that had once been part of their empire, including Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt. At their head stood a figure of truly epic proportions, the Shahanshah, or King of Kings, Shapur I. Shapur I was a brilliant commander and an ambitious ruler. He reorganized the Persian army, making its core the same armored cataphract cavalry that the Palmyrenes had, but in much larger numbers. He declared Zoroastrianism the state religion, ideologically uniting his empire. And he began a war with Rome, a war of annihilation. In the 250s, Persian armies invaded the Roman provinces. They captured and sacked the largest cities of the east, including the great Antioch, the capital of Roman Syria. The Roman legions, weakened by civil wars, suffered one defeat after another. The culmination of this humiliation came in the year 260. The Roman Emperor Valerian, who personally led the army against the Persians, suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Edessa. But what happened next was even more terrible. The emperor himself, a sacred figure, the vicar of the gods on earth, was captured by Shapur. This event shook the entire ancient world to its foundations. Never before had a Roman emperor fallen into enemy hands alive. The famous Sasanian rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam depict this scene. Shapur went on horseback, proudly looking down at the kneeling Valerian. According to humiliating rumors spread by the Persians, Shapur used the captive emperor as a living footstool, stepping on his back to mount his horse, and after his death, ordered his skin to be flayed, stuffed with straw, and displayed as a trophy in a temple. Valerian's fall was the signal for complete disintegration. The empire was decapitated. In the west, in Gaul, the general Postumus declared himself emperor and created his own state, the Gallic Empire, which included Gaul, Britain, and Spain. The east, however, was left in a power vacuum. The Persians were rampaging in Syria, the Roman legions were demoralized, and the central government in Rome, busy fighting Goths and other usurpers, was powerless to do anything. It was at this moment, at this point of absolute chaos, when it seemed that the Roman East was doomed to be swallowed by Persia, that Palmyra entered the stage. The Oasis city, hitherto just a rich trading center, suddenly became the only force in the region capable of repelling the Persian threat, and at the head of this force stood a man whose name would become the prologue to Zenobia's story. His name was Septimius Odaenathus, and while the Roman Empire writhed in agony and the Persian king Shapur celebrated his greatest triumph, a man was gaining power in Palmyra who was destined to become the first but not the last great figure of this city on the world stage. His name was Septimius Odaenathus. He belonged to one of the noblest and most powerful families of Palmyra, perhaps even to the ruling dynasty. He inherited from his ancestors not only immense wealth, but also the title of ras, or chieftain, and more importantly, the Roman status of a senator. Odaenathus was the embodiment of the Palmyrene elite. He was of Arab origin, bore a Roman name, was educated in the Greek manner, and possessed a sharp political intuition. He saw the old world crumbling and understood that in this chaos, incredible opportunities were opening up for someone bold, strong, and smart enough to seize them. Initially, like all Palmyrene rulers, Odaenathus tried to pursue a cautious, neutral policy. Palmyra prospered on trade with both empires, and entering into conflict with either was unprofitable. When Shapur began his victorious invasion, Odaenathus, according to some reports, sent him rich gifts and a letter offering his friendship. But Shapur, intoxicated with victories, arrogantly rejected this offer. He ordered the gifts to be thrown into the Euphrates River and demanded that Odaenathus appear before him in person, in chains, to beg for mercy. This arrogant act became a fatal mistake for Shapur. He had underestimated the pride and strength of the Palmyrene leader. Insulted to the core, Odaenathus made his choice. If Persia did not want to be his friend, it would become his mortal enemy. He irrevocably tied his fate to Rome, and then came the year 260. Emperor Valerian was defeated and captured. The Persian army, laden with immense booty after sacking Syria and Cappadocia, was slowly returning home. The Roman legions in the east were scattered and demoralized. It seemed nothing could stop Shapur. And at that moment, Odaenathus struck. Gathering his army of swift-mounted archers and armor-clad cataphracts, he attacked the Persians as they were crossing the Euphrates. The attack was sudden and fierce. The Persians, not expecting a blow from what they considered their rear area, were caught by surprise. Odaenathus routed their rear guard, recaptured a significant portion of the looted booty, and turned, what was particularly humiliating for Shapur, captured part of his harem. This victory had the effect of a bombshell. Little Palmyra, a city of merchants, had dared to challenge the mighty King of Kings and had won where the invincible Roman legions had failed. Odaenathus's authority soared. He became a hero, the sole defender of the Roman East. The new Roman Emperor Gallienus, son of the captive Valerian, was in a desperate situation. He was caught between the usurper Postumus in Gaul and the Goths on the Danube. He had neither the strength nor the time to deal with the East. In this situation, he made the only correct decision. He could not defeat the Persians himself, but he could empower the one who already had. Gallienus officially granted Odaenathus extraordinary powers. He received the title *Dux Romanorum*, leader of the Romans, and later the higher title *Corrector Totius Orientis*, corrector of all the East. In effect, this meant that Rome was transferring all military and civil authority in the eastern provinces into the hands of the Palmyrene ruler. Odaenathus became the viceroy of the East. He acted in the name of Rome but possessed virtually unlimited power, and he used this power with maximum effectiveness. In the following years, he conducted several brilliant military campaigns against Persia. He did not just defend the borders, he went on the counteroffensive. His Palmyrene troops, reinforced by the remnants of Roman legions, invaded Mesopotamia. They reached the walls of the Persian capital, Ctesiphon itself, and laid siege to it. Twice Odaenathus stood before the walls of the enemy capital, avenging Rome's humiliation. He restored the captured provinces to Rome, re-established the border on the Euphrates, and earned from the Senate the honorary title *Imperator*, which was usually given only to emperors. Odaenathus had created a de facto state of his own in the East. He ruled like a king, though formally he remained only a representative of Rome. He minted coins depicting himself and his eldest son, Heroine. He adopted the Eastern title King of Kings, directly challenging his enemy Shapur. Palmyra transformed from a trading city into the capital of a powerful military state that controlled the entire Roman East, from the Black Sea to Arabia, and all this time at his side was his second wife, a woman who, according to ancient authors, shared with him all the hardships of campaigns, hunted lions and panthers with him, and attended war councils. A woman whose wisdom, beauty, and ambition were no less than his own. Her name was Zenobia. She was learning, she was watching, she was absorbing the science of governing a state and waging war at the feet of her great husband. She was waiting for her hour. And that hour was near, but it would come, as it often does in history, through blood and betrayal. Before the whirlwind of events sweeps our heroine up and elevates her to the pinnacle of power, we must pause for a moment and try to discern behind the legends and myths the face of a living woman. Who was she, this Batzabai, who entered history under the name Zenobia? Ancient sources, primarily the notorious Historia Augusta paint an almost superhuman portrait, an idealized image of a warrior queen. But even through the veil of panegyrics and exaggerations, the features of a truly extraordinary personality emerge. Zenobia herself, seeking to legitimize her power, traced her lineage to the most illustrious names of antiquity. She claimed to be a direct descendant of the Macedonian kings of Egypt, the Ptolemies, and therefore of the great Cleopatra herself. This genealogical claim was not just female vanity, but a most powerful political statement. She positioned herself not as the ruler of a provincial city, but as the heiress of the great Hellenistic monarchies, as the rightful mistress of the East. Some sources add that she also traced her ancestry to the legendary founder of Carthage, Queen Dido, which was meant to emphasize her Semitic roots and contrast her with Rome, the historic destroyer of Carthage. How true these claims were is impossible to say. Most likely it was a skillfully constructed political mythology, but it indicates the scale of her ambitions. She thought not in terms of city administration, but in terms of empires and dynasties. Her appearance, according to descriptions, matched her royal claims. Chroniclers unanimously speak of her extraordinary beauty. Swarthy skin, black, sparkling eyes, pearl-white teeth, and a strong, sonorous voice. But this was not a delicate beauty, but a stern, warlike one. She despised women's litters and often rode on horseback or even walked at the head of her troops for many miles. She possessed incredible physical endurance, hardened in campaigns and hunting where, it is said, she was no less brave and skillful than her husband Odaenathus. But her main strength was not the sword but the mind. Zenobia received a brilliant education, which was rare even for noble women of that era. She was fluent not only in her native Palmyrene dialect of Aramaic, but also in Greek and Egyptian. And she knew Latin, though she spoke it reluctantly. She was immersed in Greek culture and philosophy. By her order, a history of the East was compiled, in which a special place was given to Alexander the Great and, of course, Cleopatra. She surrounded herself with a circle of the most outstanding intellectuals of her time. The main star of her court was the famous Greek Neoplatonist philosopher and rhetorician Cassius Longinus. He was not just a court tutor, he became her chief political advisor, her gray eminence. It was Longinus, many believe, who fueled Zenobia's imperial ambitions, formulated her political program, and composed the proud and defiant letters she would later send to the Roman Emperor Aurelian. Scholars, poets, and philosophers from all over the East found refuge at her court. For a short time, Palmyra became not only a military and commercial, but also an intellectual capital of the region, a kind of new Alexandria. Her personal life, as befits a great ruler, was the subject of rumors and legends. The Historia Augusta emphasizes her legendary chastity. It is claimed that she admitted her husband Odaenathus to her bed solely for the purpose of conceiving an heir, and after fulfilling her conjugal duty, she immediately withdrew. This, of course, may be a rhetorical exaggeration intended to create an image of an ideal, pure ruler, alien to carnal pleasures and completely devoted to state affairs. However, it also indicates that she perceived her marriage not as a romantic union but as a political partnership. She was not just Odaenathus's wife. She was his co-ruler, his equal partner in the great project of elevating Palmyra. She accompanied him on campaigns, participated in governance, and her influence on state affairs was enormous even during her husband's lifetime. Zenobia's character combined seemingly incompatible traits. She was capable of regal generosity and extreme cruelty. She valued learning but was ruthless to her enemies. She could feast with her officers, matching them in the amount of wine consumed while maintaining absolute clarity of mind. She was a calculating politician, but at the decisive moment she was let down by pride that grew into arrogance. She was a woman born to rule, and she felt it with every fiber of her being. She saw Rome's weakness, she saw the power of her army, she saw the wealth of her city, she saw her husband, the ruler of all the East, bearing the title King of Kings. And she undoubtedly asked herself why Palmyra should remain merely a servant of Rome. Why should it not become Rome itself? Why not create a new Greco-Semitic empire of the East with its capital in Palmyra, which would inherit the greatness of Alexander and the Ptolemies? These thoughts, fueled by Longinus's advice and Odaenathus's successes, matured in her mind. She lacked only one thing: complete undivided power. And fate, cruel and ironic, would soon provide her with this opportunity. At the height of his power in the year 267, Septimius Odaenathus, king of kings and corrector of all the East, seemed invincible. He had defeated the Persians, stabilized the eastern provinces, and enjoyed the boundless trust of Emperor Gallienus. He was preparing a new campaign, this time against the Goths, who were ravaging Asia Minor. His power was absolute, and his dynasty seemed firmly established in the East. But as often happens with great men, danger came not from the battlefield but from his innermost circle. The events that unfolded in the city of Emesa, modern Homs, or according to another version, in Heraclea Pontica, are shrouded in mystery and contradictory testimonies. Ancient sources offer several versions of the tragedy, but they agree on one thing: Odaenathus and his eldest son from his first marriage, Heroine, also known as Herodes, were assassinated. They were not killed in battle but treacherously during a feast or on a hunt. Who then held the fatal dagger? The main suspect, named by most sources, was Odaenathus's nephew or cousin, a man named Maeonius. The motive, according to one version, was a personal grudge. Allegedly, during a hunt, Maeonius showed disrespect to Odaenathus by killing an animal before him, for which Odaenathus, in a rage, deprived him of his horse and briefly imprisoned him. The humiliated Maeonius harbored a grudge and took revenge. This version seems too petty and mundane for an assassination of such scale. It may have been a convenient official explanation concealing deeper political motives. Another, more sinister version hints at the involvement of Rome itself. Emperor Gallienus, though showering Odaenathus with honors, could not but see him as a potential threat. The Palmyrene ruler had become too strong, too independent. His title, King of Kings, sounded defiant to Roman ears. Perhaps Gallienus or his circle decided to eliminate the powerful vassal before he proclaimed himself emperor. In this case, Maeonius was merely the executor, a blind instrument in the hands of Roman intelligence. And finally, the most intriguing and scandalous version, only hinted at by some authors, points to the shadow of Zenobia herself. Was she involved in the conspiracy? There is no direct evidence, and most modern historians consider it unlikely. However, it cannot be denied that the death of Odaenathus and, especially importantly, his eldest son and heir Heroine, was incredibly advantageous for Zenobia. The assassination removed from her path at once the two men who stood between her and power. It opened the way to the throne for her own young son by Odaenathus, Lucius Julius Aurelius Septimius Vabalathus Athenodorus. And since Odaenathus was still a child, real power passed into the hands of his mother. As regent, regardless of who was behind the assassination, Zenobia acted with lightning speed and determination. Maeonius, the assassin, had managed to proclaim himself ruler, but his reign lasted only a few hours. He was immediately captured and executed. Zenobia, dressed in mourning, presented her young son Odaenathus to the troops as the sole legitimate heir of his great father. The army, loyal to Odaenathus's memory and undoubtedly charmed by the charisma and strength of his widow, swore allegiance to the boy and his mother Regent. Thus, in one bloody day, Zenobia transformed from a wife and companion into an absolute ruler. She concentrated in her hands all the immense power that her husband had gathered piecemeal over many years. She became regent, but everyone understood that it was not the boy Odaenathus who would rule, but his mother. At first, she acted very cautiously. She did not break relations with Rome. On the contrary, she emphasized her loyalty in every possible way. She ruled in the name of her son, who inherited all his father's titles, including King of Kings and Corrector of all the East. On the coins she began to mint in Antioch, one side depicted Odaenathus, and the other the new Roman Emperor Aurelian, who had replaced the assassinated Gallienus. By this, she seemed to be telling Rome that they were still its loyal viceroys guarding the East for him. But behind this screen of loyalty lay a feverish activity to strengthen her own power. She conducted a purge of the army and the court, removing everyone who was not personally loyal to her. She continued to strengthen the army, focusing on heavy cavalry. She secured the support of the Arab tribes of the desert, and she listened to the advice of her mentor, Cassius Longinus, who whispered to her that the time for caution was passing. The crisis in Rome continued. Emperors succeeded one another. Aurelian was busy with wars against the Goths and Alemanni in Europe. The West was far away, and the East lay at her feet. Zenobia understood that her position as regent was temporary. As soon as her son grew up, he could remove her from power. She needed her own empire, her own glory, her own dynasty. The legacy of Cleopatra called to her. The time had come to cast off the mask of a loyal servant of Rome and show the world the true face of the Queen of the East. The brightest and most dangerous chapter of her life was beginning. Palmyra was preparing to strike. It seemed the stars themselves favored Zenobia's ambitious plans. While she was consolidating her power in Palmyra, the Roman Empire continued to plunge into chaos. Emperor Aurelian, one of the most energetic and talented commanders of the era, was absorbed with problems in the West. He needed to push the barbarians back from the borders of Italy and regain control of the breakaway Gallic Empire. The East was a secondary theater of war for him, and he apparently believed in the loyalty of the Palmyrene ruler. This gave Zenobia precious time and freedom of action. Around the year 270, she decided that the time for pretense was over. It was time to act. Her first strike was directed south at the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. The official pretext for the invasion, as always, was the protection of Roman interests, supposedly to suppress local unrest. At the head of the Palmyrene army stood her best general, Septimius Zabdas. The Roman governor of Arabia tried to resist, but his legion was defeated and the provincial capital, Bostra, was taken. Arabia, with its important trade routes and famous quarries, came under Palmyra's control, but this was only a prelude. Zenobia's main target was the jewel of the East, the richest and strategically most important province of the entire empire, Egypt. Control over Egypt gave not just power and prestige, it gave control over grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and whoever controlled the grain supply could dictate their will to the eternal city itself. Moreover, Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, was the largest port in the Mediterranean and a center of vast maritime trade with India. The capture of Egypt would be not just a territorial gain but an economic blow to Rome and a step towards creating a full-fledged, self-sufficient empire. Furthermore, Egypt, and especially its capital, Alexandria, was a cauldron of ethnic and social tensions. The city's Greek population often clashed with the Roman administration, and a significant Syrian diaspora and consequently a pro-Palmyrene party led by a certain Timagenes existed in the city. For them, Zenobia was not a foreign conqueror, but a strong Hellenistic ruler, capable of establishing order and protecting their interests better than distant and weak Rome. Zenobia skillfully exploited these internal contradictions for her own purposes. In the autumn of 270, a 70,000-strong Palmyrene army under the command of the same Zabdas, and possibly accompanied by Zenobia herself, invaded the Nile Delta. The Roman prefect of Egypt, Tenaginoprobus, was an experienced soldier, but he had few forces. At first, he managed to inflict a defeat on the Palmyrenes and drive them out of the country. But Zabdas regrouped, received reinforcements, and launched a counterattack. In the decisive battle near the walls of Babylon of Egypt, a fortress on the site of modern Cairo, the Roman troops were routed, and Tenaginoprobus himself, to avoid capture, committed suicide. The way to Alexandria was open. Soon the great city, the second largest in the empire, opened its gates to the Palmyrene conquerors. The capture of Egypt was the pinnacle of Zenobia's triumph. Now her power extended from Ancira in Asia Minor in the north to Thebes in Upper Egypt in the south. She controlled all of Syria, Palestine, Arabia, and Egypt. She had created what historians would call the Palmyrene Empire, a vast state that included the richest and most populous provinces of the Roman East. This was a real empire in its territory and resources, no less than the Gallic Empire in the west. Zenobia immediately began to act as a full-fledged empress. She stopped minting coins with Aurelian's image. Now they featured the profiles of herself and her son Vaballathus. Moreover, Vaballathus received the title Augustus *, which could only be held by a Roman emperor, and Zenobia herself adopted the title Augusta *. This was an open, unequivocal break with Rome. It was a declaration of independence and a claim to equal status. She was no longer a corrector and regent. She was an empress, the founder of a new Eastern dynasty. Her court in Palmyra or Antioch was no less magnificent than that of the Roman Caesars. She appeared in public in an imperial purple robe, in a helmet adorned with a diadem. She received ambassadors, administered justice, and ruled her vast empire with firmness and wisdom. Her administration was effective. She retained the Roman system of governance but placed loyal people in all key positions. She patronized trade, maintained order on the roads, and was tolerant of various religions, including Christianity and Judaism, which ensured her the support of the multinational population of her empire. It seemed her dream had come true. She, like Cleopatra, ruled from Alexandria. She had created an empire that the Greeks could call their own, and the Arabs and Syrians theirs. For a brief moment in history, an alternative to Rome emerged, an enlightened, rich, and tolerant Hellenistic monarchy of the East. Zenobia was on top of the world, but a shadow was already gathering over her triumph. Far to the west, on the banks of the Danube and the Rhine, the man whose name she had erased from her coins was finishing his work. Aurelian had defeated the Goths. He had destroyed the Alemanni. He had brought the Gallic Empire back into the fold of Rome. He had restored the unity of the West, and now, with his hands free, this stern and implacable soldier emperor turned his gaze to the east. He remembered the humiliation, the lost provinces, the woman who dared to call herself Augusta. The restorer of the world had not yet completed his task. He had to reclaim the other half. And he was coming for it. The greatest army Rome could muster began its march to the east. The clash of two worlds, two wills, two empires was inevitable. And while Zenobia was enjoying her triumph, weaving the richest provinces of the East into the crown of her new empire, On the other side of the world, in the crucible of incessant wars, a force was being tempered that was destined to shatter her dream. To understand the inevitability and tragedy of the coming clash, we must meet our heroine's antagonist, for he was not another weak and indecisive barracks emperor, but a figure equal to her in the scale of will and ambition. His name was Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. If Zenobia was the heiress of ancient civilizations, a refined and educated aristocrat, then Aurelian was her complete opposite. He was a product of the chaos of the 3rd century, a self-made man who had carved his way to the top with a sword. He was born into a simple peasant family somewhere in the Danubian provinces, in Illyria or Pannonia. This region in that era was the main supplier of recruits for the Roman army, and its population was famous for its strength, endurance, and martial spirit. Aurelian began his career as a common legionary. He knew neither Greek philosophy nor rhetoric. His science was war, his book, the regulations, his home, the barracks. He rose through all the ranks of the military hierarchy, from soldier to centurion, from tribune to general. He was a man of immense physical strength and legendary bravery, always fighting in the front ranks. But unlike many other soldiers, he possessed not only strength but also a mind, sharp, practical, strategic. And most importantly, he was a bearer of iron, merciless discipline. He demanded complete obedience from his soldiers and punished the slightest infraction with blood-curdling cruelty. His nickname in the army was *Manu ad ferrum *, hand on hilt, meaning he was always ready to draw his weapon, both against enemies and against his own negligent soldiers. But Aurelian was not just a soldier, he was a reformer with a grandiose ideological project. He understood that military victories alone were not enough to save the empire. He sought to give the faltering empire a new spiritual foundation, a unified cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This cult, which came from the east, was particularly popular in the army. Aurelian wanted to make it the main unifying religion for the entire empire, superimposing it over the old Roman gods. He saw the sun as the supreme deity, granting victory and order, and himself as its earthly representative. Thus, his campaign to the east was not just a reconquest of provinces. It was a holy war, a battle of two suns, his the Roman imperial unconquered sun and the eastern Palmyrene Yaribol. It was a clash not only of armies but of worldviews. Becoming emperor in 270 at almost the same time as Zenobia was invading Egypt, he immediately set to work with the same energy with which he led troops into battle. The tasks before him seemed insurmountable. Italy was under threat of invasion by Germanic tribes. The Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east had broken away. The treasury was empty and the empire lay in ruins. First, he repelled an invasion of the Vandals and Juthungi, defeating them in a series of bloody battles in northern Italy. To secure Rome itself from similar threats in the future, he began the construction of a colossal defensive structure that still bears his name today, the Aurelian Wall, which surrounded the Eternal City. Then he turned his gaze to the west. In 274, though the chronology of events is somewhat disputed by historians, and the eastern campaign may have been earlier, he invaded Gaul. In a decisive battle on the Catalonian plains, he defeated the army of the Gallic Emperor Tetricus. Gaul, Britain, and Spain returned to the fold of the empire. For this campaign, the Senate granted him the title Germanicus Maximus *, and so, having secured Europe, Aurelian was finally able to deal with the East. He gathered veteran legions from the Danubian and Rhine frontiers, battle-hardened soldiers personally loyal to him. But this was no longer the army of Caesar or Trajan. Its core was still heavy infantry, but now it was supported by a diverse and deadly array of auxiliary troops. Swift-footed Moorish javelin men, experienced Dalmatian and Pannonian cavalry, even German mercenaries who had recently been enemies. Aurelian forged this multinational host into a single weapon, held together not by old Roman ideals but by a brutal loyalty to him as their commander and the promise of victory and plunder. This was a new, more pragmatic, and perhaps more brutal Roman army, perfectly suited to its stern emperor. In the spring of 272, Aurelian began his great eastern campaign. He moved not by sea but by land, through the Balkans and Asia Minor. His advance was swift. Cities that tried to resist him were taken by storm and severely punished. Cities that opened their gates to him received pardon. The most famous episode of this campaign was the siege of the city of Tyana in Cappadocia. Aurelian, enraged by the defenders' obstinacy, swore that after taking the city he would not leave even a dog alive in it. When the city fell, the soldiers prepared for a massacre, but Aurelian, wishing to show not only his cruelty but also his mercy and to preserve the rich city, gave an order whose essence was that he had promised not to leave a single dog alive, so all the dogs should be killed, but the people should not be touched. This gesture made a huge impression on other cities in Asia Minor, which after that surrendered to him without a fight. Aurelian's army, like an inexorable steamroller, approached Syria, the heart of Zenobia's empire. The queen in Palmyra received alarming reports. She realized that the time of easy victories was over. She was about to face not indecisive Roman governors, but the Iron Emperor himself, the restorer of the world. She gathered all her forces, armored cataphracts, mounted archers, infantry. Her best general, Zabdus, was appointed to command them. The two greatest armies of that era were marching towards each other. The fate of the East was to be decided in open battle. The first great clash between the forces of Aurelian and Zenobia took place on the plain near Antioch, at a place called Immae. This was a battle where two different military philosophies were to meet. On the one hand, the famous Palmyrene heavy cavalry, considered invincible, and on the other, the disciplined and flexible Roman army, hardened by decades of war. Zenobia and her general Zabdus were confident of victory. Their main trump card was the cataphracts. These horsemen, clad along with their horses in sun-bued metal armor, were living battering rams. Their charge was like the blow of an iron fist, which had so far crushed all resistance. Zabdus's plan was simple and effective: to lure the Romans onto an open plain and destroy their legions with a single massive charge of his heavy cavalry, while light archers showered the enemy with arrows from the flanks. Aurelian, however, was not the kind of commander to be caught off guard. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of his opponent perfectly well. He understood that in a head-on collision, his infantry might not withstand the onslaught of the cataphracts. Therefore, he developed a cunning plan. When the battle began, the Roman army seemed to fall into confusion. The light Roman cavalry, after a brief skirmish, began a feigned retreat, drawing the Palmyrene cataphracts after them. Confident of an easy victory, the Palmyrene horsemen gave chase. This was precisely the trap Aurelian had set. The Romans retreated for several kilometers under the scorching Syrian sun. The heavy armor that was the cataphracts' advantage in a short fight now became their curse. The riders and, more importantly, their horses began to tear from the heat and the weight of their armor. And when Aurelian saw that the Palmyrene cavalry was stretched out, had lost formation, and was exhausted from the chase, he gave the order. The Roman cavalry turned and launched a counterattack. Simultaneously, the fresh Roman legions entered the battle. Exhausted, deprived of their main advantage, the power of a unified charge, the cataphracts were surrounded and defeated. The Battle of Immae ended in a complete victory for Aurelian. Zabdus, with the remnants of his army, fled in panic to Antioch. To save the rest of his troops and buy time, Zabdus resorted to a ruse. He found a man who resembled Aurelian, dressed him in imperial robes complete with a gray beard, and paraded him triumphantly through the streets of Antioch, announcing that the Roman emperor had been captured. This allowed him to withdraw his troops from the city unimpeded under the cover of night and retreat south to Emesa to join the main forces led by Zenobia herself. Aurelian, upon entering the abandoned Antioch, showed wisdom. He did not punish the city but granted its inhabitants a full pardon, thereby winning their loyalty. He then moved in pursuit of Zenobia's army. The decisive battle of the entire war took place on the plain before the city of Emesa. Here Zenobia had gathered all she had, a huge army numbering, according to some reports, up to 70,000 men. Its core was still the cataphracts, eager for revenge for the defeat at Immae. The Battle of Emesa was even more fierce and bloody. This time, the Palmyrene cavalry acted more successfully. At the very beginning of the battle, it delivered a terrible blow to the Roman cavalry, crushed it, and put it to flight. Victory seemed near. The cataphracts pursuing the fleeing Romans became separated from their infantry, and at this critical moment, the iron discipline of the Roman legions showed itself. While their cavalry was retreating, the infantry standing in the center did not waver. Aurelian was personally among his soldiers, inspiring them with his presence. The legionaries locked their shields and met the attack of the Palmyrene infantry, and then Aurelian threw his reserve into the battle. He used Palestinian detachments armed with heavy clubs and maces. This simple but terrible weapon proved surprisingly effective against armored horsemen. The Palestinians did not try to pierce the armor. They struck at the horses' legs and stunned the riders themselves, knocking them from their saddles. Deprived of the support of its cavalry, which was bogged down in pursuit, the Palmyrene infantry could not withstand the coordinated strike of the Roman legions and was completely routed. The battlefield was strewn with bodies. Zenobia's second and last great army ceased to exist. The fate of the war was decided. Zenobia, with the remnants of her loyal troops, fled, but she fled not to Emesa, but further across the desert to her last stronghold, her capital, the impregnable Palmyra. She had lost the field battles, but she had not yet lost the war. She hoped that the walls of her native city, the power of the desert, and the help of her Persian allies would save her. She was preparing for a final, desperate defense. After the crushing victory at Emesa, the way to Palmyra was open for Aurelian. But this path lay across hundreds of kilometers of waterless desert. This was Zenobia's last and most reliable ally. The queen was confident that the Roman army, accustomed to the temperate climate of Europe, would simply be unable to cross this scorching barrier. She expected that thirst, heat, and constant raids by her loyal Bedouin tribes would exhaust the Roman strength long before they saw the walls of her capital. But Aurelian was not a man to retreat before difficulties. He was a genius not only of tactics but also of logistics. He had carefully prepared for the campaign. He made alliances with some Arab sheikhs hostile to Palmyra, and they provided his army with water, provisions, and guides. His legions, accustomed to the most arduous marches, slowly but steadily advanced through the desert, repelling the nomads' attacks. And finally, the Roman army reached the walls of Palmyra. Even the battle-hardened legionaries were struck by the sight of this miracle city, risen from the sands. But the admiration was short-lived. Aurelian immediately began the siege. Zenobia inside the city was full of determination. She rejected Aurelian's first offer of an honorable surrender. The text of her proud reply, transmitted in the *Historia Augusta *, has survived. Although its authenticity is disputed, it perfectly reflects her spirit. In it, Zenobia, Queen of the East, reminded Aurelian Augustus that in war, valor, not letters, decides everything. She declared that she would not surrender, just as Queen Cleopatra had preferred to die rather than live in dishonor. She wrote that she was expecting help from the Persians, Saracens, and Armenians, and asked, would he despise enemies who had gathered from all sides? The siege was long and difficult. The walls of Palmyra were high and strong, and its defenders, inspired by their queen, fought with the desperation of the doomed. The city had large reserves of food and water. Aurelian himself, directing the siege, was wounded by an arrow. But time was working against Zenobia. The help she so desperately hoped for did not arrive. The Persian Empire, after the death of Shapur-Verfers, was weakened by internal troubles and was in no hurry to get involved in a war with the victorious Roman emperor. Detachments of Armenians and Bedouins were defeated by Roman flying squads. Gradually, the ring of siege tightened. Food shortages began to be felt in the city. Hope was fading, and then Zenobia made her last, desperate decision. She decided to flee. Her plan was audacious. Under the cover of night, on the fastest dromedary camel, accompanied by a few loyal servants, she was to slip through the Roman cordons and reach the Euphrates, and from there Persia. There she hoped to personally persuade the Persian king to come to her aid with a new army. This was her last chance to turn the tide of the war. The escape was initially successful. She managed to leave the besieged city unnoticed. But Roman intelligence was not asleep. Aurelian, learning of her flight, immediately sent a detachment of his best cavalry in pursuit. The chase lasted for several hours. The Romans caught up with the fugitives on the banks of the Euphrates at the very moment when Zenobia was preparing to board a boat to cross to the other side. She was captured. The Queen of the East, Augusta, descendant of Cleopatra, became a prisoner. When she was brought to Aurelian's camp, the emperor, according to tradition, asked her one question. How did you, a woman, dare to challenge the Roman emperors? Zenobia's reply was full of dignity and subtle flattery. She said that she did not consider emperors such as Gallienus and his ilk, but him, Aurelian, she recognized as a true emperor, for he knew how to conquer. The news of the queen's capture broke the spirit of Palmyra's defenders. The city immediately capitulated. Aurelian again showed mercy. He did not destroy the beautiful city, but only took its immense treasures and, leaving a small garrison, moved back to the west, taking with him his precious captive. But the story of Palmyra did not end there. As soon as Aurelian left Syria, a new rebellion broke out in the city. The inhabitants massacred the Roman garrison and proclaimed a new ruler. Learning of this, Aurelian, whose mercy had its limits, flew into a rage. He turned his army around and returned by forced march. This time there was no mercy. The city was taken by storm and given over to the soldiers for plunder. The great Palmyra, the jewel of the desert, was destroyed and burned. Its columns were toppled, its temples desecrated, and its inhabitants slaughtered or sold into slavery. Aurelian had wiped not just a city off the face of the earth. He had destroyed an entire civilization. The star of Palmyra had set forever. And for its queen, the last road awaited, the road to Rome, to the triumph of her conqueror and the verdict of history. And so we return to where our story began. To Rome, to Aurelian's triumphal procession. Now we know who this woman in golden chains was, what path she had traveled from the ruler of an oasis to the empress of the East, and what price she paid for her dream. Her appearance in the triumph was the culmination of the whole event. The Romans, who had heard of her beauty, pride, and former power, looked at her with a mixture of schadenfreude, admiration, and pity. She was a living symbol of the restored unity of the empire, the most precious trophy of her conqueror. But what became of her after this day of humiliation and glory? What was the finale of her incredible life? Here, the ancient sources again diverge, offering us two main versions, two different epilogues to her story. The first version, more dramatic and perhaps more in keeping with her proud character, states that Zenobia, unable to bear the shame, committed suicide shortly after the triumph by starving herself to death. This ending directly alludes to her great predecessor and idol Cleopatra, who also chose voluntary death by the bite of an asp over a humiliating existence in captivity. This version turns Zenobia into a tragic heroine who remained true to her ideals to the end and was not broken even in defeat. However, Most authors, including the most reliable of them, Zosimus, offer another, more prosaic, but perhaps more truthful story. According to this version, Aurelian, having satisfied his pride and demonstrated his greatness to Rome, showed his noble captive uncharacteristic mercy. He spared her life. Moreover, he gave her a luxurious villa in Tibur, modern Tivoli, near Rome, where many Roman aristocrats lived. There, far from the Syrian desert and the ghosts of her collapsed empire, Zenobia lived out the rest of her days as a wealthy and respected Roman matron. She led a secluded life, raising her children. Her daughters married noble Roman senators, and her descendants, it is said, could be traced in Roman society as late as the 5th century. She transformed from a warrior queen into a quiet mistress of an estate, perhaps finding in philosophy and memories consolation for her grandiose losses. Which of these versions is true? We will never know for sure, but perhaps the second version, for all its ordinariness, is a more subtle and profound ending. Death would have been too simple an escape. Life, however, life in a golden cage, in honorable exile, surrounded by the culture of the enemy she so despised and so wanted to emulate, could have been a far more sophisticated and prolonged punishment for her. Or perhaps the wise and pragmatic Zenobia, realizing the game was lost, simply accepted the new rules and decided to secure a future for her children, since she could not secure one for her empire. Regardless of the finale of her personal fate, Zenobia's legacy proved to be far more enduring than her kingdom. She entered history as one of the most outstanding women of antiquity. For subsequent generations, she became a symbol. A symbol of what? Here, too, there is no single opinion. For the Romans, she was an example of dangerous female ambition, a reminder of what happens to those who challenge the might of the eternal city. For the Arab peoples, she became a legendary heroine, the warrior queen Zainab, a symbol of resistance and national pride. During the Enlightenment and Romanticism, her image inspired artists, poets, and playwrights, who saw in her a fighter for freedom against tyranny, a tragic figure ahead of her time. In our time, she is sometimes presented as an icon of feminism, a woman who, in a world dominated by men, managed to build her own empire and rule it no worse than any emperor. But whoever she was, a reckless adventuress, a wise ruler, a victim of circumstances, or the master of her own destiny, her story remains an eternal reminder of the fragility of empires and the indomitability of the human spirit. It is the story of a city that, like a mirage, arose from the sands to dazzle the world with its brilliance for a moment, and just as quickly disappeared, and of a woman who was the soul of this city, its sun and its doom. Her golden chains have long since turned to dust, but her name still echoes in the colonnades of ruined Palmyra, a reminder of former greatness and the great dream of the Queen of the East. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you and you wish to continue immersing yourselves in the most dramatic and ambiguous pages of world history, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this account with those who might be interested. Many more journeys through time await us.